In the winter of 1812, 15 children vanished from a small frontier settlement in what would become southern Illinois. The disappearances weren't random acts of wilderness predation or Indian raids, as the local militia initially believed. They were methodical, calculated, and carried out by the very people the community trusted most with their children's education and moral guidance. The Kensington family had operated the Prairie View Academy for nearly 3 years, earning respect as devoted educators who accepted students from families across 3 counties. But beneath their veneer of Christian virtue lay secrets so dark that when the truth finally emerged, it would be buried by territorial authorities who deemed the facts too horrific for public knowledge. The official records were sealed, the surviving witnesses relocated, and the story deliberately forgotten. Until now. What makes this case particularly chilling is that it wasn't discovered through investigation or suspicion, but through the confession of a dying child who managed to escape. The child's final words, spoken to her mother with her last breath, would expose a network of ritualistic murder that had been operating under the guise of religious education for over 3 years. The territorial government's response was swift and decisive. Complete suppression of all evidence, relocation of witnesses, and the systematic destruction of any documentation that might reveal the true horror of what became known in sealed records as the Prairie View Incident. Before we continue with the story of the Kensington family and their house of horrors, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We're about to uncover one of America's most disturbing family secrets. Also, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with our audience across the country. The story you're about to hear has never been told in its entirety, pieced together from fragments of survivor testimony, sealed court documents, and the private journals of those who lived through this nightmare. The horror began not with violence but with hope. The hope of frontier parents who believed they had found salvation for their children's futures in the form of a family dedicated to education and God. The territory of Illinois in 1812 was a harsh, unforgiving frontier where survival depended on community cooperation and trust. Prairie View was a settlement of roughly 200 souls, established along the banks of the Sangamon River, where fertile soil promised prosperity to those brave enough to face the wilderness. The community consisted mainly of families from Kentucky and Tennessee who had pushed northward seeking better farmland and escaped from the tensions building toward what would become the War of 1812. The settlement itself was a testament to frontier ingenuity and determination. Log cabins dotted the landscape in rough clusters, connected by muddy paths that became nearly impassable during spring thaws and autumn rains. At the center of the community stood Jeremiah Caldwell's General Store, which also served as the unofficial town hall where important decisions were made and news was shared. Adjacent to the store, a small Methodist chapel provided spiritual guidance under the leadership of circuit rider Samuel Hayes, who visited monthly when weather and Indian activity permitted. Life in Prairie View was governed by the rhythms of agricultural necessity and the constant awareness of danger. Families worked from dawn to dusk during planting and harvest seasons, while winters brought the dual challenges of isolation and survival. Children were expected to contribute to family labor from an early age, making formal education a luxury that most families could barely contemplate, let alone afford. The nearest established school was over 60 miles away in Kaskaskia, the territorial capital, making education accessible only to the wealthiest families who could afford to send their children away for months at a time. Most Prairie View children learned basic reading and arithmetic from their parents, if they learned at all. The illiteracy rate in the settlement exceeded 70%, a source of shame for parents who remembered their own limited education and dreamed of better opportunities for their children. This educational vacuum made the arrival of Cornelius and Matilda Kensington in the spring of 1809 seem like divine intervention. Cornelius, a tall, gaunt man with penetrating gray eyes and prematurely white hair, claimed to be a former seminary student from Pennsylvania who had received a divine calling to bring learning to the frontier. His credentials seemed impeccable. He could recite lengthy passages of scripture from memory, demonstrated fluency in Latin and Greek, and possessed an extensive library of religious and educational texts that impressed even the most skeptical settlers. Matilda Kensington, his wife of 23 years, presented herself as the daughter of a Philadelphia schoolmaster who had inherited her father's passion for education. She was a stern woman with sharp features and pale blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her demeanor was austere but not unkind, and she displayed remarkable patience when working with children who had never held a book or written their own names. Her knowledge of literature, mathematics, and domestic arts convinced Prairie View parents that their children would receive an education equal to anything available in eastern cities. The Kensingtons' twin sons, Jeremiah and Josiah, both 24 years old, served as assistant instructors and disciplinarians. The twins were pale, thin young men who bore such a striking resemblance to each other that even long-time residents sometimes couldn't tell them apart. They spoke rarely and always in unison when they did speak, creating an unsettling effect that most people attributed to their close bond and shared educational calling. Both had received extensive religious training from their father and could lead prayers, recite scripture, and conduct basic theological discussions with remarkable sophistication. The family's arrival in Prairie View had been preceded by impressive letters of recommendation from religious leaders in Pennsylvania, though the specific locations and individuals mentioned were vague enough to be difficult to verify. Cornelius explained that they had felt called to bring Christian education to the frontier after receiving what he described as a divine vision showing children in darkness, crying out for spiritual and intellectual enlightenment. The Kensingtons established Prairie View Academy in a large 2-story log structure they built on a hill overlooking the settlement. The building was impressive by frontier standards. 24 rooms including dormitories, classrooms, a chapel, and living quarters for the family. The construction took nearly 8 months and involved most of the settlement's men, who donated labor in exchange for reduced tuition for their children. The building's design incorporated several unusual features that Cornelius claimed were based on educational theories he had studied in Pennsylvania. Small, windowless rooms for individual instruction, a basement chapel for religious education, and storage areas that seemed disproportionately large for a school. They accepted both day students and boarders, charging modest fees that even struggling farmers could manage. Parents could pay in grain, livestock, or labor when cash wasn't available, making education accessible to families who had never imagined such opportunities for their children. The curriculum promised instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, geography, natural philosophy, Latin, and religious studies, a scope of learning that exceeded what was available in many established Eastern schools. The Academy's reputation grew rapidly throughout the surrounding counties. Word spread through trading networks, church gatherings, and family connections that Prairie View had become home to an educational institution that rivaled anything available in territorial capitals. Families began planning to relocate closer to the academy, while others arranged for their children to board there during winter months when farm work was minimal. The Kensingtons seemed genuinely devoted to their students' moral and intellectual development. Cornelius was known for his lengthy evening prayers and strict adherence to scripture, conducting daily chapel services that combined religious instruction with moral guidance. His sermons emphasized the importance of obedience, sacrifice, and dedication to God's will, themes that resonated with frontier families struggling to maintain Christian values in a harsh environment. Matilda taught reading, writing, and domestic skills with apparent patience, often working individually with students who struggled to overcome years of educational neglect. She had developed innovative teaching methods that seemed particularly effective with frontier children, using familiar examples from farm life to illustrate abstract concepts and creating learning games that made education enjoyable rather than burdensome. The twins, though somewhat odd in their intense silence and pale complexions, maintained order without the brutal corporal punishment common in most schools of the era. Instead of physical discipline, they used a system of religious counseling and moral instruction that appeared to be remarkably effective. Students who misbehaved were taken for private conferences, where the twins would discuss the spiritual implications of their actions and guide them toward repentance and improvement. Families from as far as 50 miles away began sending their children to board at Prairie View Academy during the winter months when farm work was minimal. The Kensingtons welcomed these arrangements, often keeping students for months at a time and maintaining detailed correspondence with parents about their children's progress. Parents appreciated not only the affordable education and moral guidance their children received, but also the relief from feeding and caring for extra mouths during the harsh winter months when resources were stretched thin. The boarding arrangement seemed ideal for all involved. Children received consistent education in comfortable surroundings. Parents could focus on essential winter preparations without worrying about their children's safety and development. And the Kensingtons earned enough income to maintain their academy and gradually expand their services. The system worked so well that by the winter of 1811, Prairie View Academy was housing over 30 boarding students from across 3 counties. What none of the trusting parents realized was that they were delivering their most precious possessions into the hands of monsters who had perfected the art of appearing saintly while harboring the darkest of intentions. The Kensington family had spent years developing their facade, learning exactly what frontier communities needed and wanted to hear, and positioning themselves as the answer to every parent's prayers. Their true nature would remain hidden for 3 horrific years, protected by their victims' innocence and their community's desperate desire to believe in their goodness. The first disappearance occurred on November 23, 1811, but wasn't immediately recognized as such. 12-year-old Samuel Hartwell, son of blacksmith William Hartwell from nearby Cedar Creek, simply failed to return home for the Thanksgiving holiday as planned. Samuel had been boarding at Prairie View Academy since early October, and his letters home had been filled with enthusiasm for his studies and gratitude for the opportunity to learn alongside children from other settlements. When Samuel failed to arrive home by the expected date, his father, William, initially assumed the boy had been delayed by weather or had misunderstood the arrangements. The autumn of 1811 had been particularly harsh, with early snowstorms making travel dangerous, and William knew that Cornelius Kensington was cautious about allowing students to travel in unsafe conditions. However, when 3 additional days passed without word from either Samuel or the academy, William decided to make the difficult journey to Prairie View to collect his son personally. The 20-mile ride through muddy trails and early snow took William nearly 6 hours, and he arrived at Prairie View Academy just as the sun was setting behind the hills. The building looked peaceful and welcoming, with warm yellow light glowing from several windows and smoke rising from multiple chimneys. As William approached the main entrance, he could hear the sound of children's voices singing hymns, which reassured him that the academy was operating normally and that Samuel was likely safe inside. Cornelius Kensington met him at the gate with an expression that immediately filled William with dread. The educator's usually composed demeanor was replaced by genuine sorrow, and his hands trembled slightly as he extended them in a gesture of sympathy and comfort. "Brother Hartwell," Cornelius said, his voice heavy with practiced grief, "I fear the Lord has called your Samuel home to his eternal reward. The boy took fever 3 days past, came on him sudden-like while he was at his studies. We did everything we could. Matilda sat with him day and night. We applied every remedy we know, and we prayed without ceasing. But the Lord's will cannot be denied, and young Samuel passed peacefully in his sleep, asking for his father and mother in his final moments." William felt the world spinning around him as Cornelius continued his explanation. The fever had struck without warning, affecting Samuel's lungs and causing him to weaken rapidly despite the family's best efforts to save him. They had considered sending word immediately, but the recent storms had made travel impossible, and by the time conditions improved, Samuel had already passed away. Rather than allow the boy's body to deteriorate while waiting for his parents to arrive, the Kensingtons had made the difficult decision to bury him in their family plot behind the chapel, conducting a proper Christian service with full honors. "We've been praying for your family's comfort," Matilda added, appearing beside her husband with tears in her eyes. Samuel was such a bright, godly child. His last words were about how grateful he was for the education he'd received, and how he hoped his parents would understand that he had learned to love Jesus even more deeply through his final trial. William Hartwell was devastated, but not immediately suspicious. Childhood diseases killed frontier children with terrifying regularity, and he knew of several families who had lost children to sudden fevers, consumption, and other ailments that seemed to strike without warning. The Kensingtons' grief appeared genuine, their explanation plausible, and their decision to bury Samuel quickly seemed reasonable given the circumstances and weather conditions. The blacksmith viewed the simple wooden cross marking his son's grave, with tears streaming down his weathered face. The burial site was located in a small cemetery behind the Academy's chapel, surrounded by other graves that Cornelius explained belonged to previous students who had died during epidemics in earlier years. The grave itself was properly dug and marked with a wooden cross bearing Samuel's name, dates of birth and death, and a brief inscription reading, "Beloved student, now with Jesus." Matilda provided William with a small bundle of Samuel's personal belongings, his few items of clothing, a slate for writing practice, and a small wooden cross that Cornelius had carved as a memorial gift. She also gave him a lock of Samuel's hair tied with a blue ribbon, explaining tearfully that she had cut it just before the burial as a keepsake for his parents. The attention to detail and genuine emotion in her presentation convinced William that the Kensingtons had truly cared for his son and had done everything possible to save him. The journey home was a blur of grief and acceptance. William understood that frontier life was harsh and unpredictable, that death could strike anyone at any time, and that even the best care couldn't always prevent tragedy. He was grateful that Samuel had died in comfortable surroundings, cared for by people who valued education and Christian principles. The boy's final months had been filled with learning and spiritual growth, which provided some comfort during this devastating loss. Over the following months, 5 more children died at Prairie View Academy, all supposedly from various illnesses that struck during the harsh winter season. Each death followed a similar pattern: sudden onset of illness, rapid deterioration despite the Kensingtons' best efforts, peaceful death surrounded by prayer and comfort, and immediate burial in the Academy cemetery to prevent the spread of disease. In December, 10-year-old Mary Patterson from Hickory Grove died of what Cornelius described as brain fever, a condition that caused delirium and convulsions before claiming her life after 4 days of suffering. Her parents, Robert and Elizabeth Patterson, received the news through a letter delivered by a traveling merchant, along with a small prayer book that Mary had supposedly been reading during her final hours. January brought the death of 14-year-old Joseph Fletcher from Sugar Creek, who allegedly succumbed to consumption after weeks of declining health. His father Thomas received word of the death, along with a wooden angel that Joseph had supposedly carved as a Christmas gift for his parents, but had been too ill to send before his passing. February saw the loss of 8-year-old Rebecca Martinez, whose parents had traveled from nearly 40 miles away to enroll her in the Academy's specialized program for younger children. She died of what the Kensingtons described as lung fever, complicated by her small size and delicate constitution. Her memorial service, conducted entirely by the Kensington family due to weather preventing her parents' attendance, was described in a detailed letter that included quotes from Rebecca's supposed final prayers. In March, brothers David and Andrew Kelly, ages 11 and 13, both died within days of each other from what appeared to be the same mysterious fever that had claimed Samuel Hartwell. Their deaths were particularly tragic because they had been inseparable in life and had supposedly asked to be buried side by side so they could continue their studies together in heaven. The Kensingtons' sorrow seemed genuine with each loss. Their funeral services properly respectful and doctrinally sound. They never requested additional payment for burial expenses and often provided small memorial tokens to grieving families. Locks of hair, favorite books, carved wooden crosses, or personal items that the deceased children had supposedly created as gifts for their families. But by the summer of 1812, a disturbing pattern had emerged that several parents began to discuss privately during trading expeditions and church gatherings. All the deceased children had been boarders, never day students who returned home each evening. All had died during periods when other students were away for planting or harvest, meaning no witnesses could corroborate the illnesses or provide independent accounts of the children's final days. Most unsettling, all the children who died were considered particularly bright or talented, the ones most likely to succeed in life beyond the frontier. Samuel Hartwell had shown remarkable aptitude for mathematics and reading. Mary Patterson had been gifted in music and languages. Joseph Fletcher had demonstrated unusual artistic ability. Rebecca Martinez had been reading at a level far beyond her age. The Kelly brothers had both shown promise in multiple subjects and had been among the most enthusiastic students at the academy. The whispered concerns might have remained just that, except for Martha Prescott's growing anxiety about her 10-year-old daughter Anne. The girl had been boarding at the academy since September, and her letters home had grown increasingly strange and disturbing. Anne wrote of new students who arrived but never seemed to stay long, of hearing crying in the night that the Kensingtons claimed was just winter wind, of lessons that took place in the basement where children learned special subjects that she wasn't permitted to discuss with outsiders. Most troubling were Anne's descriptions of changes in the other students' behavior. Children who had been cheerful and outgoing when they first arrived at the academy gradually became withdrawn and fearful. Several students had developed what Anne described as the pale sickness, a condition that made them listless and obedient, but caused them to cry when they thought no one was watching. Martha Prescott had initially attributed her daughter's strange letters to homesickness and adjustment difficulties, but as the weeks passed, Anne's descriptions became more specific and alarming. The girl wrote about special ceremonies that took place in the basement chapel, about students who were chosen for advanced spiritual instruction and were never seen again, about the twins Jeremiah and Josiah who seemed to watch everyone constantly and reported everything to their parents. When Martha rode to Prairie View in early December to bring Anne home for Christmas, she found the academy strangely quiet, despite the presence of over 20 boarding students. The usual sounds of children playing, laughing, and studying were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to hang over the entire building like a shroud. Matilda Kensington met her at the door with the familiar sorrowful expression that had become her trademark when delivering bad news to parents. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, and her pale blue eyes avoided direct contact as she spoke. "I'm afraid Anne has taken ill," Matilda said, wringing her hands in apparent distress. "The same fever that claimed young Samuel and the others. It came on sudden like yesterday evening while she was at her prayers. She's resting now, too weak for visitors and somewhat delirious from the fever. The physician in us recommends you return in a few days when she's stronger and more herself. We wouldn't want you to remember her in such a distressed state." But Martha Prescott was a mother whose instincts had been sharpened by weeks of worry and mounting suspicions. Something in Matilda's manner seemed rehearsed and false, lacking the genuine grief that had characterized her earlier encounters with bereaved parents. The explanation was too convenient, too similar to previous deaths, and came at a time when Martha was already harboring doubts about the academy's operations. Without waiting for permission, Martha pushed past Matilda into the academy's main hall and called her daughter's name. The response she heard would haunt her for the rest of her life. A weak, terrified voice crying, "Mama! Help me, Mama!" from somewhere deep within the building, followed immediately by the sound of a door slamming and heavy footsteps moving rapidly across wooden floors. The voice was unmistakably Anne's, and it carried a note of desperate terror that no fever could explain. Martha ran toward the sound, calling her daughter's name and demanding to see her immediately. Behind her she could hear Matilda's protests and Cornelius's voice joining in with explanations about delirium and the need for quiet. But Martha's maternal instincts had taken over completely. Martha Prescott's confrontation with the Kensingtons on that December afternoon created the first crack in their carefully constructed facade. When she demanded to see her daughter immediately, pushing past their protests and heading toward the sound of Anne's voice, the family's usual composure visibly strained. Cornelius appeared from the back of the building with uncharacteristic haste, his grey hair disheveled and his hands trembling with what appeared to be nervous energy rather than religious fervor. "Mrs. Prescott, please understand," Cornelius said, attempting to block her path while maintaining his pastoral demeanor. "Young Anne is delirious with fever and might not recognize her mother. In her confused state, she might say things that would cause unnecessary distress. We've seen this before with other students. The fever affects their minds and causes them to imagine threats that don't exist." But Martha had heard the terror in her daughter's voice, a fear so raw and genuine that no illness could explain it. She continued toward the stairs leading to the second floor, where Anne's cries had originated, while Cornelius and Matilda followed behind, offering increasingly desperate explanations. The twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, had appeared from somewhere in the building and now stood silently at the foot of the stairs, their pale faces expressionless but their eyes alert and watchful. The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with Martha demanding immediate access to her daughter, while the Kensingtons insisted that such a visit would be harmful to both mother and child. The discussion might have continued indefinitely, except for Anne's voice calling out again, this time with words that sent chills through everyone present. "Mama, don't let them take me to the basement again. Please don't leave me here." The reference to the basement was the final straw for Martha's patience. Her daughter's letters had mentioned basement lessons and special instruction, but the terror in Anne's voice suggested something far more sinister than religious education. When Martha threatened to return immediately with the territorial sheriff and a full investigation, the Kensingtons' resistance finally crumbled. Reluctantly, with obvious reluctance and continued warnings about Anne's delirious condition, the family led Martha to a small room on the second floor where her daughter lay in bed. The sight that greeted her was shocking. Anne was pale and thin, having lost considerable weight since Martha had last seen her, but she was clearly not suffering from any fever. The girl's eyes were wide with terror, and she clutched her mother's hand with desperate strength while casting fearful glances toward the Kensingtons. "She's been like this since the illness began," Matilda explained, though her voice lacked conviction. "The fever broke yesterday, but she remains confused and frightened. Dr. Coleman from Kaskaskia examined her and recommended complete rest and limited stimulation until her mind clears." Martha knew immediately that her daughter was not ill, but terrified. Anne's grip on her hand was firm and steady, her eyes were clear and focused, and her whispered pleas for help were entirely coherent. When Martha announced they were leaving immediately, Anne whispered something that made her blood run cold. "Mama, they're not all buried in the cemetery. Some of them are still in the basement." The ride home through the gathering darkness was silent, except for Anne's occasional whimpers and fearful glances over her shoulder. Martha could feel her daughter's terror radiating like heat, and she knew with absolute certainty that something terrible had been happening at Prairie View Academy. Once safely in their own cabin, with the door barred and Anne wrapped in familiar quilts by their own fire, the child's story began to emerge in fragments over several days. Anne spoke in whispers about strange lessons in the basement chapel, where Cornelius would teach advanced spiritual concepts to selected students. These lessons involved learning about sacrifice, obedience, and the special role that children could play in God's plan for salvation. Students who showed particular aptitude for these concepts were chosen for individual instruction that took place during nighttime hours when other children were sleeping. The girl described ceremonies that took place in a stone chamber beneath the basement chapel, where Cornelius would conduct what he called covenant rituals, designed to prepare children for special service to God. The ceremonies involved drinking bitter herbal preparations that made students feel drowsy and compliant, followed by prayers and religious instruction that Anne couldn't fully remember due to the effects of the drugs. Most disturbing were Anne's descriptions of students who were selected for these covenant rituals and were never seen again afterward. When other children asked about their missing classmates, the Kensingtons would explain that these students had been chosen for special missions and had been sent to spread God's word in distant territories. Anne had believed these explanations initially, but gradually became suspicious when none of the departed students ever sent letters or messages back to their friends. The twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, played a central role in these activities, serving as assistants during the covenant ceremonies and maintaining constant surveillance over the remaining students. They seemed to take particular pleasure in the fear they inspired, often appearing silently in doorways or corridors to watch students with their pale, unblinking eyes. Anne described feeling constantly watched and judged, never knowing when she might be selected for special instruction. Martha Prescott wasn't the only parent harboring growing suspicions about Prairie View Academy. Thomas Fletcher, whose 13-year-old son Benjamin had supposedly died of consumption in October, had been increasingly troubled by inconsistencies in the Kensington story. Benjamin's final letter home had been unlike anything the boy had ever written, filled with sophisticated theological language and complex religious concepts that seemed impossible for a barely literate farm boy to understand, let alone articulate. The letter had arrived just days before news of Benjamin's death, and it described the boy's excitement about being selected for advanced studies that would prepare him for great service to the Lord. Benjamin wrote about learning secrets that would make him successful in spreading God's word, and about the honor of being chosen from among all the students for special instruction. For a child who had struggled to write his own name 6 months earlier, the letter's vocabulary and theological sophistication seemed not just unlikely, but impossible. Thomas Fletcher had also been disturbed by the circumstances surrounding his son's supposed burial. When he visited the gravesite at Prairie View Academy, he found the earth too loosely packed for a burial that had supposedly taken place weeks earlier. The wooden cross marking the grave was crudely made and appeared recent, lacking the weathering that should have occurred during exposure to autumn rains and early winter weather. Most troubling was Thomas's conversation with Dr. Ezra Coleman, the circuit physician who served several frontier settlements in the region. When Thomas inquired about his son's final illness, Dr. Coleman revealed that he had never been called to examine Benjamin or any other student at Prairie View Academy. The Kensingtons had claimed they treated their students themselves using medical knowledge gained from Cornelius's seminary training, but frontier communities typically relied on professional medical care for serious illnesses. Dr. Coleman's revelation prompted Thomas to investigate further, and he discovered that none of the supposedly deceased students had received professional medical attention during their final illnesses. The Kensingtons had consistently refused offers of medical assistance, claiming that their religious principles required them to rely on prayer and herbal remedies rather than conventional medicine. While such beliefs weren't uncommon among frontier religious communities, the pattern of refusing all outside medical help seemed suspicious, given the Academy's unusually high mortality rate. Additional disturbing evidence came from Jacob Winters, a fur trapper who regularly passed Prairie View Academy on his route between settlements. Winters was a solitary man who spent most of his time in the wilderness, but his keen observation skills and familiarity with normal patterns of frontier life made him notice details that others might miss. Over the course of several months, Winters had observed increased activity at the academy during supposedly quiet periods when most students were away for seasonal farm work. He had noticed smoke rising from the building's chimneys on warm nights when no heating should have been necessary, candlelight visible in windows during the early morning hours before dawn, and most unsettling, the sound of digging coming from behind the chapel during nighttime hours. On 3 separate occasions, Winters had observed what appeared to be fresh graves in the Academy cemetery that seemed much smaller than would be needed for human burial. When he mentioned this observation to Cornelius Kensington during a chance encounter in Prairie View's general store, The educator's reaction was telling. Immediate defensive anger followed by an unconvincing explanation about relocating the remains of beloved pets that had died during the harsh winter. Winters had also noticed changes in the behavior of students he encountered during his travels. Children who had been cheerful and talkative when first enrolling at the academy gradually became withdrawn and fearful during subsequent encounters. Several students he had met on multiple occasions showed dramatic personality changes, becoming subdued and overly deferential in ways that seemed unnatural for healthy children. The trapper's most disturbing observation concerned the twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, whom he had encountered on several occasions during nighttime travels near the academy. The young men had been engaged in activities that seemed inappropriate for educators, burying objects behind the chapel under cover of darkness, loading heavy sacks into wagons during the early morning hours, and conducting what appeared to be surveillance of the surrounding area as if watching for unwanted observers. These individual concerns and observations began to coalesce into a pattern of suspicious activity that several Prairie View residents started discussing privately. Parents compared notes about their children's strange letters, their behavioral changes during visits home, and the unusual number of deaths at an institution that prided itself on providing healthy, nurturing environment for frontier children. The discussions were initially hesitant and tentative, as no one wanted to falsely accuse respected community members of wrongdoing. The Kensingtons had invested considerable time and resources in establishing their academy, had provided educational opportunities that had genuinely benefited many children, and had consistently demonstrated knowledge and dedication that seemed authentic and valuable. However, the accumulating evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore or explain away. The pattern of deaths affecting only the brightest and most promising students, the refusal to allow professional medical care, the strange behavioral changes in surviving students, and the various observational evidence provided by community members like Jacob Winters created a picture that was deeply troubling. The situation reached a critical point when Martha Prescott began sharing Anne's testimony with other concerned parents. Her daughter's accounts of basement ceremonies, missing students, and systematic intimidation provided context for the various isolated observations that others had made. When Anne's story was combined with Thomas Fletcher's suspicions about his son's death and Jacob Winters's observations of nighttime activities, a horrifying possibility began to emerge. But direct action against the Kensingtons remained problematic due to their standing in the community and the lack of definitive proof of wrongdoing. The family's religious credentials and educational achievements provided them with credibility that would be difficult to challenge without overwhelming evidence. Additionally, the frontier justice system was not equipped to handle complex investigations, and territorial authorities were reluctant to interfere with educational institutions that served important community needs. The breakthrough that would finally expose the truth would come from an unexpected source, and would reveal horrors that exceeded even the worst suspicions of concerned parents. The harsh winter of 1812-1813 provided the Kensingtons with temporary protection from scrutiny, as snow made travel between settlements nearly impossible for several months. The academy remained isolated on its hill overlooking Prairie View, with only a handful of boarding students whose parents lived too far away to attempt winter travel. This isolation seemed to provide the family with a false sense of security, leading them to become careless about maintaining their facade of normalcy. It was during this period of isolation that Anne Prescott began experiencing severe nightmares that revealed additional details about her time at the academy. Under her mother's gentle questioning, she described a horrifying ritual that took place every few weeks in the basement chapel. Selected students would be brought down for what Cornelius called covenant ceremonies, religious services where children would pledge their souls to a higher purpose through suffering and sacrifice. Anne's descriptions were fragmented and sometimes incoherent due to the psychological trauma she had experienced, but certain details remained consistent across multiple tellings. The basement chapel contained a stone altar that Cornelius claimed was blessed by angels and possessed special powers to communicate with heaven. Children who participated in covenant ceremonies were promised they would become special messengers of God, serving as bridges between the earthly and divine realms. The ceremonies began with the selected child being given herbal preparations that Cornelius described as sacred medicines, designed to purify the soul and prepare it for divine communication. These substances caused drowsiness, confusion, and a strange sense of detachment that made resistance difficult or impossible. Anne remembered feeling as though she was watching events from outside her own body, aware of what was happening, but unable to control her responses. Once the child was properly prepared, they would be brought to the stone altar, where Cornelius would conduct elaborate prayers and incantations. The twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, would stand on either side of the altar like pale sentinels, reciting responses in what sounded like Latin, but might have been gibberish, designed to create an atmosphere of religious mystery. Matilda would provide musical accompaniment on a small organ, playing funeral dirges that added to the ceremony's solemn and frightening atmosphere. Most disturbing was Anne's account of what happened to children after they participated in covenant ceremonies. Those who underwent the ritual were never seen again by other students, with the Kensingtons explaining their absence by saying they had been called to serve in distant missions or had ascended to a higher level of spiritual service. Anne remembered the overwhelming smell of herbs and candle smoke during these ceremonies, the feeling of cold stone against her skin, and the terrible certainty that something irreversible was happening to the chosen children. Anne's nightmares also revealed details about the physical layout of the academy that had previously been hidden from casual observation. She described a network of tunnels and hidden rooms beneath the main building, connected to the basement chapel through concealed doorways that appeared to be solid walls. These hidden areas contained what she could only describe as punishment rooms, where disobedient students were taken for correction, and where the sounds of crying and pleading were common during nighttime hours. The girl's testimony about these hidden areas was corroborated by her descriptions of architectural features that would have been impossible for her to know about unless she had actually been in these spaces. She accurately described the location of support beams, the pattern of stonework, and the arrangement of drainage systems that would only be visible to someone who had spent considerable time in the basement areas. Meanwhile, other parents were conducting their own investigations into the disturbing activities at Prairie View Academy. Thomas Fletcher had carefully examined his son's grave and found additional evidence that the burial had been faked. When he probed the earth with a long iron rod, he encountered no resistance at the depth where a coffin should have been located. Instead, the rod passed easily through loose soil and encountered what felt like rocks and debris rather than the solid wood of a burial container. Fletcher's investigation of the cemetery revealed similar problems with other supposed burial sites. None of the graves showed evidence of the soil compaction that would result from actual interment of human remains, and several of the wooden crosses marking graves appeared to have been recently carved, despite supposedly marking deaths that occurred months earlier. Most damning was Fletcher's discovery that the cemetery's layout didn't match the Kensingtons' claims about its history. Cornelius had explained that the burial ground had been established by previous settlers and that the academy had simply continued using the site for student burials. However, Fletcher's examination revealed that all the graves appeared to be of recent origin, with none showing the weathering and settling that would be expected from burials dating back several years. The investigation took on new urgency when Dr. Ezra Coleman made a disturbing discovery during his winter rounds. While treating a family for influenza in a settlement 30 miles from Prairie View, he encountered a woman named Sarah Henderson, who claimed to have worked briefly as a servant at the academy during the previous summer. Henderson's testimony provided the first outside perspective on the Kensingtons' operations and revealed details that confirmed the worst suspicions of concerned parents. According to Henderson, her employment at Prairie View Academy had lasted only 3 weeks before she fled in terror. She had been hired to help with cooking and cleaning during the busy summer session when the academy housed its maximum number of students. Initially, she had been impressed by the family's apparent dedication to education and their students' respectful behavior. However, Henderson quickly noticed disturbing patterns in the academy's daily operations. Students seemed unusually fearful and subdued, constantly looking over their shoulders as if expecting punishment or correction. The twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, maintained constant surveillance over both students and staff, appearing silently in doorways and corridors to observe activities without explanation or apparent purpose. Most troubling were the nighttime activities that Henderson witnessed during her brief employment. She described being awakened regularly by sounds coming from the basement areas, chanting, crying, and what sounded like furniture being moved around. When she asked Matilda about these disturbances, she was told they were prayer meetings for students who needed extra spiritual guidance, but the sounds were unlike any religious services Henderson had ever heard. Henderson's most damning testimony concerned her discovery of bloodstains in the basement areas while performing cleaning duties. She had found what appeared to be dried blood on stone surfaces, along with strange implements that looked like medical or surgical instruments. When she asked about these items, Cornelius explained that they were tools used for treating injured animals. But Henderson had worked on farms her entire life and recognized that the implements were not designed for veterinary use. The servant's employment had ended abruptly when she accidentally discovered one of the hidden rooms that Anne Prescott had described in her nightmares. While cleaning the basement chapel, Henderson had noticed that one of the stone walls seemed to have an unusual gap at its base. When she investigated, she found a concealed door that led to a small chamber containing what appeared to be restraints and torture devices. Confronted with this discovery, the Kensingtons had immediately dismissed Henderson from their service, claiming that her work was unsatisfactory and that she had been spreading malicious rumors about the academy. They had escorted her from the property immediately and warned her against discussing her employment with anyone, suggesting that false accusations against a religious institution would result in divine punishment. Henderson's testimony provided crucial corroboration for Anne Prescott's accounts and gave concerned parents the confidence to take more direct action. However, approaching territorial authorities remained problematic due to the Kensingtons' reputation and the lack of definitive proof of criminal activity. The family's standing in the community and their apparent religious devotion made accusations seem implausible to officials who had never witnessed their private behavior. The situation changed dramatically in early February 1813, when a traveling merchant named Marcus Webb made a discovery that would finally force official intervention. Webb had been caught in a severe snowstorm while traveling between settlements and had sought shelter in an abandoned cabin approximately 2 miles from Prairie View Academy. While waiting for the storm to pass, he had observed unusual activity at the academy during the nighttime hours. Webb watched from his shelter as figures carrying lanterns moved between the academy building and what appeared to be a wooded area behind the structure. The activity continued for several hours and involved multiple trips carrying what looked like heavy bundles or sacks. Most disturbing was Webb's observation that the figures seemed to be digging in the frozen ground, creating new disturbances in areas that showed evidence of previous excavation. The merchant's training in commerce had made him naturally observant and detail-oriented, and he carefully noted the timing, location, and nature of the activities he witnessed. When the storm cleared and he was able to continue his journey, Webb made careful mental notes of landmarks and geographical features that would allow him to relocate the areas where he had observed the nighttime digging. Webb's account became even more significant when he reported it to territorial officials in Kaskaskia, where his reputation as a reliable merchant gave his testimony substantial credibility. Unlike local residents who might be influenced by personal relationships or community loyalties, Webb was an outside observer with no stake in protecting or condemning the Kensingtons. His professional reputation depended on accuracy and truthfulness, making his account particularly compelling to territorial authorities. The confluence of evidence, Anne Prescott's testimony, Sarah Henderson's observations, Thomas Fletcher's cemetery investigation, Jacob Winters's reports of suspicious activity, and Marcus Webb's account of nighttime digging finally provided enough justification for official intervention. The territorial sheriff, Captain James Mitchell, found himself facing a situation that exceeded his normal experience with frontier crime, but could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Captain Mitchell was a practical man who had dealt with various forms of frontier violence, including Indian raids, claim disputes, and the occasional murder motivated by personal grudges or financial gain. However, the Kensington case presented unique challenges that would test his investigative skills and his understanding of human evil. The family's reputation for piety and education made the accusations seem almost impossible to believe. Yet the accumulating evidence suggested that something deeply wrong was occurring at Prairie View Academy. The investigation that would finally expose the truth began to take shape as Mitchell assembled a team of deputies and prepared to confront the Kensingtons with the growing body of evidence against them. What they would discover would exceed even the worst fears of concerned parents and reveal a level of systematic evil that would shock the frontier community to its core. As spring arrived in 1813, the territorial sheriff, Captain James Mitchell, could no longer ignore the mounting evidence against Prairie View Academy. Mitchell was a veteran of frontier law enforcement who had served in various capacities since the territory's establishment. But the Kensington case presented challenges unlike anything in his previous experience. The family's reputation for religious devotion and educational excellence made the accusations seem nearly impossible to believe. Yet the consistency and detail of witness testimony demanded serious investigation. Mitchell's first step was to assemble a team of reliable men who could assist with what promised to be a complex and potentially dangerous investigation. He selected Deputy Sheriff William Crawford, a former military officer who had experience with organized criminal activity during his service in the regular army. Dr. Ezra Coleman would accompany the team to provide medical expertise in evaluating any evidence of violence or abuse. Finally, Mitchell recruited Reverend Samuel Hayes, the circuit rider who served Prairie View's Methodist Chapel, to provide religious authority and help assess the Kensingtons' theological claims. The investigation began officially on April 15, 1813, when Mitchell and his team rode to Prairie View Academy under the pretense of conducting a routine inspection of the settlement's educational facilities. Their stated purpose was to ensure compliance with territorial standards and to assess the academy's eligibility for potential government funding. But their real mission was to examine the cemetery and question the Kensingtons about the unusual number of student deaths. The approach to the academy revealed immediately that something was amiss. The building, which had previously bustled with activity and the sounds of children learning, was strangely quiet, despite being supposedly in the middle of its spring session. No children were visible in the windows or playing in the surrounding areas, and the silence was broken only by the sound of the investigators' horses and the distant barking of dogs from the settlement below. Cornelius Kensington met them at the academy gate with his usual composed demeanor. But Mitchell's experienced eye immediately detected signs of stress that the educator was attempting to conceal. Cornelius's hands trembled slightly as he extended them in greeting. Perspiration was visible on his forehead despite the cool spring weather, and his eyes darted nervously toward the cemetery before returning to focus on his visitors. "Captain Mitchell, what an unexpected pleasure," Cornelius said, his voice carrying its usual pastoral warmth, but with an undertone of tension that hadn't been present in previous encounters. "How may the Prairie View Academy serve the territorial government today? I trust this visit indicates official recognition of our educational mission and perhaps consideration for the funding support we've requested." Mitchell's response was carefully neutral, designed to avoid alarming the Kensingtons while establishing the legal authority for his investigation. He explained that territorial officials had received reports of unusual mortality rates at frontier educational institutions and were conducting assessments to ensure that proper medical care and burial procedures were being followed. While presented as routine administrative oversight, the inquiry was actually focused specifically on Prairie View Academy based on the accumulated evidence of suspicious activity. When asked to provide records of student deaths and burials, Cornelius's demeanor shifted noticeably. His usual confidence was replaced by defensive anxiety as he explained that all documentation had been destroyed in a small fire that had occurred during the previous winter. The fire, he claimed, had started in the academy's office when a candle had been accidentally knocked over during evening prayers, consuming enrollment records, medical reports, and burial documentation before it could be brought under control. Dr. Coleman found this explanation immediately suspicious, as frontier institutions typically kept multiple copies of important records and would have made extraordinary efforts to preserve documentation related to student deaths. The destruction of all records related to mortality was particularly convenient given the timing of the official investigation, suggesting deliberate concealment rather than accidental loss. The medical examination of the cemetery revealed problems that confirmed the worst suspicions of concerned parents. Several graves showed signs of recent disturbance, despite supposedly containing remains that were months old. More troubling, when Dr. Coleman probed the soil in 2 graves using a long metal rod, he found no evidence of human remains at appropriate depths. The graves appeared to contain only loose soil, rocks and debris, rather than the coffins and bodies that should have been present. Confronted with this discovery, Matilda Kensington became visibly distressed, wringing her hands and speaking rapidly about wild animals that had disturbed the graves. She claimed that the family had been forced to move remains to deeper plots to prevent scavenging, but her explanation was inconsistent and unconvincing. The supposed animal disturbance would have left characteristic evidence that was clearly absent from the cemetery, and the pattern of soil displacement was inconsistent with natural or animal-caused disruption. The twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, remained silent throughout the investigation, standing behind their parents like pale sentinels with their characteristic blank expressions. Their behavior struck Mitchell as unusual even for shy or withdrawn young men. They never spoke, never made eye contact with the investigators, and seemed to communicate with their parents through subtle gestures and meaningful glances. When Mitchell attempted to question them directly about their role in the academy's operations, they would only nod or shake their heads in response, maintaining an eerie silence that added to the increasingly tense atmosphere. Reverend Hayes's theological assessment of the academy's religious practices revealed additional troubling inconsistencies. When questioned about their doctrinal beliefs and educational methods, Cornelius provided answers that demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of Christian theology, but included unusual interpretations that seemed designed to justify harsh treatment of students. His emphasis on suffering as a path to spiritual enlightenment and his descriptions of children as vessels for divine purpose struck the experienced minister as problematic and potentially dangerous. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Mitchell decided to search the academy building itself, using his authority as territorial sheriff to override the Kensingtons' objections. The family's protests became increasingly desperate as the investigators moved through the structure, examining rooms and areas that had previously been off-limits to outsiders. Their behavior suggested that they were attempting to prevent discovery of something specific rather than simply protecting their privacy or maintaining the dignity of their educational mission. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Prairie View intensifies. If this story's giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The search of the academy's main floors revealed a disturbing absence of evidence related to normal educational activities. Despite claims of housing dozens of students, the building showed little sign of recent occupation. Classrooms contained outdated materials and showed minimal wear from student use. Dormitory areas were clean, but appeared to have been hastily arranged to create the impression of regular occupancy. Most significantly, there was no evidence of the personal belongings, clothing, or other items that would accumulate in any institution housing children for extended periods. Mitchell's attention was particularly drawn to the basement areas, which the Kensingtons had initially attempted to declare off-limits due to safety concerns about unstable foundations. When the sheriff insisted on examining these areas as part of his official investigation, the family's resistance became more pronounced and their explanations more implausible. Cornelius claimed that the basement was used only for storage and contained nothing relevant to the investigation, but his obvious anxiety suggested otherwise. The discovery that would change everything came when Deputy Crawford noticed inconsistencies in the basement's stone walls. What appeared to be solid masonry actually contained concealed openings that led to hidden chambers beyond the main basement area. These hidden rooms had been carefully camouflaged to appear as part of the building's foundation, but careful examination revealed that they were actually functional spaces designed for purposes that were clearly not educational. As the investigators prepared to examine these hidden areas, the Kensingtons' facade finally began to collapse completely. Matilda became hysterical, alternately pleading with the officers to respect their privacy and claiming that the hidden rooms contained only religious artifacts that were too sacred for secular examination. Cornelius's theological composure cracked as he began speaking rapidly about divine missions and the necessity of sacrifice for spiritual advancement, revealing the twisted religious delusions that had motivated his crimes. The twins' behavior became even more disturbing as they seemed to anticipate what the investigation would reveal. They stood perfectly still, watching the proceedings with expressions that seemed to combine resignation with a strange form of satisfaction, as if they welcomed the opportunity to have their activities exposed and understood. Their silence took on a more sinister quality as it became clear that they were not simply shy or withdrawn, but were deliberately concealing knowledge of terrible crimes. Mitchell realized that he was facing a situation that exceeded anything in his previous law enforcement experience. The evidence suggested not just individual criminal acts, but a systematic pattern of abuse and murder that had been operating under cover of religious education for years. As his team prepared to enter the hidden chambers beneath Prairie View Academy, he understood that they were about to uncover secrets that would shock the frontier community and challenge everyone's understanding of human evil. The investigation was about to reveal the full scope of the Kensingtons' crimes and expose a level of systematic cruelty that would forever change how frontier communities thought about trust, education, and the protection of their most vulnerable members. Faced with undeniable evidence of deception and the discovery of hidden chambers beneath their academy, Sheriff Mitchell placed the entire Kensington family under arrest on April 16, 1813. The formal charges were initially fraud and conspiracy, but everyone involved understood that far more serious crimes were likely to be revealed as the investigation continued. As the family was being restrained and prepared for transport to the territorial jail in Kaskaskia, a shocking discovery would expose the true extent of their evil and provide definitive proof of crimes that exceeded even the darkest suspicions. The breakthrough that would finally reveal the full horror came from an unexpected source. 11-year-old Rebecca Hawthorne, who had been a student at Prairie View Academy but had returned home for spring planting just 3 weeks before the investigation. Rebecca's parents, Jonathan and Mary Hawthorne, had noticed their daughter's strange behavior since leaving the school, but had initially attributed it to adjustment difficulties and the normal challenges of readapting to farm life after months of structured education. However, news of the Kensingtons' arrest reached the Hawthorne family through the Frontier Communication network of traders and traveling families, prompting Rebecca to reveal what she had witnessed during her final weeks at the academy. The child's testimony, given in the presence of her parents and Sheriff Mitchell in the safety of the family's cabin, painted a picture of systematic abuse and murder that shocked even experienced frontier lawmen who thought they had seen every form of human violence. Rebecca's account began with descriptions of the academy's daily operations that seemed normal on the surface, but contained disturbing undercurrents of fear and control. Students were subjected to constant surveillance by the twins, who would appear silently in doorways and corridors to observe activities without explanation. Children learned quickly to avoid attracting attention to themselves, as those who showed too much curiosity or independence were selected for special instruction that other students learned to fear. The girl described a rigid hierarchy among the students based on their compliance with the Kensington's demands and their willingness to participate in increasingly strange religious activities. Children who demonstrated complete obedience were granted small privileges and protection from the harshest punishments, while those who showed any signs of resistance or independent thinking were subjected to escalating forms of psychological and physical abuse designed to break their spirits and ensure complete submission. Most damning was Rebecca's detailed account of the covenant ceremonies that took place in the hidden basement chapel. These rituals were presented to students as advanced religious instruction available only to the most spiritually gifted children, creating a perverse form of competition where students actually sought to be selected for experiences that would ultimately lead to their deaths. Rebecca had been present during one covenant ceremony involving a 13-year-old boy named Peter Caldwell, whose parents had sent him to the academy from a settlement nearly 50 miles away. Peter had been among the academy's most promising students, demonstrating exceptional ability in reading and mathematics while maintaining the kind of questioning intellect that would have served him well in life beyond the frontier. The ceremony Rebecca witnessed had taken place on a cold February night when most students were confined to their dormitories due to severe weather conditions. Peter had been told that he was being honored with selection for advanced spiritual instruction that would prepare him for important service to God and his community. The boy had been excited about the opportunity, viewing it as recognition of his academic achievements and spiritual development. The ritual began in the main basement chapel, where Cornelius conducted what appeared to be a normal religious service, complete with prayers, hymns, and scripture readings. However, as the ceremony progressed, Peter was given herbal preparations that Cornelius described as sacred medicines designed to purify his soul and prepare it for direct communication with divine forces. These substances caused the boy to become drowsy and compliant, unable to resist what followed. Rebecca's testimony became more fragmented and difficult to follow as she described the ceremony's progression into the hidden chamber beyond the main chapel. The concealed room contained a stone altar surrounded by carved symbols and lit by dozens of candles that created an atmosphere of ancient religious mystery. Peter was placed on the altar while Cornelius conducted elaborate prayers and incantations, with the twins serving as assistants and Matilda providing musical accompaniment on a small harmonium. What Rebecca witnessed in that hidden chamber was a systematic process of torture disguised as religious ritual. Peter was subjected to increasingly severe physical abuse, while Cornelius claimed that his suffering was necessary for spiritual purification and divine communication. The boy's cries for help were interpreted as prayers, his pleas for mercy dismissed as tests of faith that he needed to overcome through complete submission to God's will. The ceremony continued for hours, with Peter's condition deteriorating as the abuse escalated. Rebecca remembered the overwhelming smell of herbs and candle smoke, the sound of the boy's weakening voice calling for his parents, and the terrible certainty that something irreversible was happening. When Peter finally lost consciousness, Cornelius declared that he had achieved spiritual transcendence and was ready for the final stage of his divine mission. According to Rebecca, Peter Caldwell had not died immediately during the ceremony. Instead, he had been kept in the hidden chamber beneath the basement chapel for several days, while the Kensingtons told other students that he had been sent to a distant mission to spread God's word among frontier settlements that lacked proper religious instruction. Rebecca had heard his weakened cries for help during subsequent nights and had seen Jeremiah bringing food and water to the concealed chamber. The girl's most horrifying testimony concerned Peter's final fate. On her last night at the academy, she had been awakened by sounds of activity in the basement areas and had crept from her dormitory to investigate. Through a crack in the floorboards, she had witnessed the twins removing Peter's body from the hidden chamber and preparing it for disposal, in a manner that she could only describe in fragments due to her trauma and the darkness that concealed many details. Rebecca's testimony provided Sheriff Mitchell with the roadmap he needed to uncover the full scope of the Kensington's crimes. Returning to Prairie View Academy with a larger investigation team that included additional deputies and territorial officials, they conducted a systematic search of the hidden chambers and surrounding areas that revealed evidence of prolonged torture and multiple murders that had been carefully concealed over the course of 3 years. The hidden chamber that Rebecca had described was found exactly as she had testified, a stone room containing an altar surrounded by carved symbols and ritual implements. Iron shackles were bolted to the walls at heights appropriate for restraining children, and the stone floor was stained with what Dr. Coleman immediately identified as human blood. The room's design and contents left no doubt that it had been used for systematic torture disguised as religious ceremony. More horrifying discoveries awaited in the Academy's cellar and the wooded areas behind the main building. Using information provided by Rebecca and guided by Marcus Webb's observations of nighttime digging, the investigators found a series of shallow graves containing the actual remains of at least 15 children. The bodies showed signs of prolonged abuse and systematic torture that confirmed Rebecca's testimony about the covenant ceremonies and revealed the true fate of students who had supposedly died of natural causes. The physical evidence of the murders was overwhelming and undeniable. Some children had been dismembered, others showed evidence of ritualistic mutilation, and all had been buried with bizarre arrangements of stones and carved symbols that suggested some form of perverted religious ceremony. Dr. Coleman's examination revealed that the children had endured prolonged suffering before death, with injuries consistent with the torture implements found in the hidden chamber. In Cornelius Kensington's private study, investigators discovered journals that documented 3 years of systematic child murder disguised as religious education. The entries, written in Cornelius's careful script, revealed a mind that had completely divorced itself from normal human morality, while maintaining the ability to function effectively in civilized society. The journals described his belief that children possessed special spiritual energy that could be harvested through torture and sacrifice, and that this energy could be used to build a bridge between earth and heaven. The writings revealed the twisted theological framework that Cornelius had developed to justify his crimes. He believed that frontier children were particularly pure and therefore especially valuable for spiritual purposes, and that their suffering could be transformed into divine power through proper ritual procedures. The journals contained detailed descriptions of ceremony protocols, evaluations of individual students' spiritual potential, and plans for expanding his operations to additional frontier settlements. The journals also revealed that the Kensingtons had been motivated by a combination of twisted religious delusion and simple financial greed. They had collected tuition payments for children they murdered, then continued accepting payment for months by claiming the children were still alive, but too ill to communicate with their families. The scheme had generated substantial income that the family used to purchase land, acquire expensive religious artifacts, and maintain their facade of humble educators dedicated to serving frontier communities. Most disturbing were Cornelius's detailed records of each child's torture and murder, written with the clinical detachment of a researcher documenting scientific experiments. He had carefully noted each victim's responses to different forms of abuse, their spiritual progress through various stages of suffering, and his assessment of the divine energy released through their deaths. The complete absence of human sympathy or recognition of his victims' humanity revealed a level of moral corruption that exceeded anything in the investigators' previous experience. The twins' role in the crimes was documented through their father's journals and confirmed by physical evidence found in their personal quarters. Jeremiah and Josiah had served as more than mere assistants in their father's rituals. They had developed their own twisted enthusiasm for torture and murder that seemed to exceed even Cornelius's religious delusions. Their rooms contained personal collections of items taken from murdered children, along with crude drawings depicting scenes of torture and death that suggested they had found genuine pleasure in their victims' suffering. The trial of the Kensington family began in territorial court in September 1813. But the proceedings were unlike anything the frontier justice system had encountered. The evidence was so overwhelming and disturbing that territorial authorities made the unusual decision to conduct much of the trial in closed sessions to prevent public panic and maintain social order in the region. The case had already generated intense interest throughout the territory, with settlers traveling from distant settlements to witness the prosecution of crimes that seemed to exceed the boundaries of human evil. Judge William Harrison, recently appointed to the territorial bench after distinguished service in the military, presided over proceedings that would test every aspect of the frontier legal system. Harrison had dealt with various forms of criminal behavior during his judicial career, but the Kensington case presented challenges that went beyond legal precedent into questions of human psychology and the nature of evil itself. The prosecution was led by Territorial Attorney General Samuel Edwards, who faced the difficult task of presenting evidence that was so horrific it risked creating sympathy for the defendants while ensuring that justice was served for crimes that demanded the ultimate punishment. Edwards had carefully studied the physical evidence, witness testimony, and written confessions to build a case that would convince even skeptical jurors of the defendant's guilt, while maintaining the dignity and solemnity appropriate to such serious proceedings. Cornelius Kensington showed no remorse during his testimony, instead attempting to justify his actions through elaborate theological arguments that revealed the depth of his delusion and the complete absence of normal human conscience. He claimed that the murdered children had achieved a higher form of existence through their suffering, and that their families should be grateful for the spiritual elevation their children had received through his rituals. His testimony, delivered with the same pastoral composure he had displayed while operating the academy, chilled observers who recognized that they were witnessing a form of evil that maintained the appearance of righteousness while perpetrating the most heinous crimes imaginable. Cornelius spoke of divine visions that had revealed the necessity of child sacrifice, of religious doctrines that justified torture as spiritual purification, and of his belief that he had been chosen by God to conduct rituals that would prepare the world for divine transformation. The complete lack of remorse in Cornelius's testimony, combined with his continued insistence that he had been doing God's work, convinced many observers that he was genuinely insane rather than simply evil. However, Dr. Coleman's expert testimony established that Cornelius had maintained sufficient understanding of right and wrong to function effectively in society, plan complex criminal activities, and deliberately conceal his crimes from detection. His madness, if it could be called that, was of a type that enhanced rather than diminished his legal and moral responsibility for his actions. Matilda Kensington's defense was different, but equally disturbing in its implications. She claimed to have been under her husband's complete psychological control, following his religious interpretations without question, and participating in murder only because she believed she was serving God's will. Her testimony described a gradual process of indoctrination that had begun early in their marriage and had slowly eroded her ability to think independently about moral questions. However, evidence from survivor testimonies suggested that Matilda had been an active and enthusiastic participant in selecting victims and had shown particular cruelty toward children who resisted the family's authority. Rebecca Hawthorne's testimony specifically identified Matilda as the family member who had chosen her for potential sacrifice, and who had displayed obvious pleasure when describing the spiritual benefits that would result from her participation in covenant ceremonies. The prosecution's evidence demonstrated that Matilda had maintained correspondence with parents of murdered children for months after their deaths, creating elaborate fictions about their supposed illnesses and recoveries while collecting continued tuition payments. The sophistication and consistency of these deceptions indicated clear understanding of the criminal nature of her activities and deliberate intent to profit from murder while maintaining her facade of caring educator. The twins, Jeremiah and Josiah, never spoke during the trial proceedings. Court records indicate that they communicated only through written responses and seemed genuinely unable or unwilling to explain their actions in any comprehensible way. Several witnesses testified that the twins appeared to worship their father and had carried out murders with the enthusiasm of devoted disciples rather than reluctant accomplices forced to participate against their will. Dr. Coleman's examination of the twins revealed individuals who had been so completely shaped by their father's delusions that they seemed to lack any independent moral framework or capacity for normal human empathy. Their behavior during the trial, sitting motionless for hours, responding to questions with blank stares, and showing no emotional reaction to testimony about their crimes, suggested a level of psychological damage that went beyond simple criminal behavior into territory that challenged contemporary understanding of human nature. The trial's most dramatic moment came when surviving victim Anne Prescott was called to testify about her experiences at Prairie View Academy. Despite her young age and the trauma she had endured, Anne provided clear and detailed testimony about the systematic abuse and murder she had witnessed. Her account corroborated Rebecca Hawthorne's testimony while adding additional details about the family's methods and the fate of specific victims whose disappearances had been explained as natural deaths or missionary assignments. Anne's testimony was particularly powerful because of her obvious intelligence and the specific details she provided about events that would have been impossible for her to fabricate. Her descriptions of the hidden chambers, torture implements, and ritual procedures matched exactly with physical evidence discovered by investigators, while her accounts of individual victims' suffering provided human context for crimes that might otherwise have seemed abstract and incomprehensible. All 4 family members were convicted of multiple counts of murder and conspiracy under territorial law. The evidence against them was so overwhelming that the jury required less than 2 hours to reach unanimous verdicts on all charges. Judge Harrison's sentencing reflected both the severity of the crimes and the community's need for justice that would restore faith in fundamental human decency. Under territorial law, the punishment for multiple murders was death by hanging, to be carried out in Kaskaskia on November 30, 1813. However, the executions created their own controversy when Cornelius Kensington used his final words to deliver a lengthy religious sermon, predicting that his death would unleash divine retribution on the territory, and that his victims would return from death to punish those who had interfered with God's plan. The execution of the Kensington family was attended by hundreds of settlers from across the territory who came to witness justice for crimes that had shaken their fundamental assumptions about human nature and community safety. The event was conducted with appropriate solemnity and dignity, but the crowd's reaction revealed the depth of anger and horror that the case had generated throughout frontier society. Matilda Kensington's final words were a tearful apology to the families of murdered children. Though many observers questioned the sincerity of repentance that came only after conviction and sentencing, the twins maintained their silence to the end, dying without ever explaining their actions or expressing any recognition of the evil they had perpetrated against innocent children. The aftermath of the Kensington case had far-reaching effects on frontier education and community trust that lasted for decades. Parents became intensely suspicious of boarding schools and traveling educators, preferring to keep their children close to home, even if it meant accepting limited educational opportunities. The concept of entrusting children to strangers, regardless of their apparent credentials or religious devotion, became anathema to frontier families who had learned that evil could hide behind facades of respectability and righteousness. The Prairie View Academy building was burned to the ground by angry families who gathered on the day after the executions to destroy any physical reminder of the horrors that had occurred there. The cemetery was relocated after religious authorities declared the ground defiled, and the children's remains were reburied in consecrated ground with proper ceremonies conducted by ministers from across the territory. Perhaps most significantly, territorial officials made the decision to suppress most details of the case from public records and newspaper accounts. They feared that widespread knowledge of such systematic child murder would damage the territory's reputation, discourage further settlement, and create panic among existing residents. Official documents were sealed, witnesses were encouraged to relocate to distant settlements, and the few newspaper accounts that appeared were heavily edited to downplay the ritualistic aspects of the murders. This official suppression means that the true scope of the Kensington family's crimes may never be fully known. Some historians believe that the 15 confirmed victims represent only a fraction of their actual murders, and that similar crimes may have been committed during the family's earlier years in Pennsylvania before they came to Illinois territory. The sealed territorial records, if they still exist, remain classified to this day, hidden in archives that few researchers have been able to access. The families of the victims struggled with grief, compounded by the knowledge that their children had endured prolonged torture before death. Several parents left Illinois territory entirely, unable to remain in a place associated with such horror, and unable to find peace in communities where every child's laughter reminded them of their own losses. Others found comfort in establishing memorial gardens and contributing to the construction of churches dedicated to their children's memory. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of frontier communities to predators who could exploit trust and isolation for criminal purposes. The Kensingtons had successfully operated their House of Horrors for 3 years because frontier parents had few alternatives for educating their children, and because community survival depended on trusting neighbors and newcomers who claimed to share common values and goals. What makes the Kensington case particularly chilling is how easily it could have continued indefinitely if not for a few crucial factors. Anne Prescott's rescue by her mother's intuition, Rebecca Hawthorne's courage in revealing what she had witnessed, and the determination of concerned parents to overcome their respect for authority and demand official investigation. Without these elements, the family might have continued murdering children for years or even decades, expanding their operations to additional settlements and claiming hundreds of additional victims. The psychological impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate families affected by the murders. Frontier communities had been forced to confront the reality that evil could operate successfully within their midst, protected by religious authority and educational credentials that seemed to guarantee moral character. The trust that had been essential for frontier survival was permanently damaged, replaced by suspicion and vigilance that would characterize frontier society for generations. Educational development in the Illinois Territory was set back by decades as parents refused to entrust their children to any institution that required separation from family supervision. The literacy rate, which had been slowly improving through the efforts of legitimate educators like the Kensingtons claimed to be, remained stagnant for years as families chose ignorance over the risk of losing their children to predators disguised as teachers. This mystery shows us how evil can hide behind facades of respectability and righteousness, and how communities must balance trust with vigilance to protect their most vulnerable members. The Kensington family's ability to maintain their educational mission while systematically murdering their students reveals the terrifying potential for predators to exploit society's most sacred institutions and most noble aspirations. The case also demonstrates the importance of listening to children when they report abuse or express fear about adults in positions of authority. Anne Prescott's strange letters and Rebecca Hawthorne's courage in speaking truth to power were crucial factors in exposing crimes that might otherwise have continued indefinitely. Their testimony reminds us that children often possess insights about dangerous situations that adults miss because of their own preconceptions and assumptions. Perhaps most importantly, the Kensington case illustrates the danger of allowing religious or educational authority to operate without oversight or accountability. Cornelius Kensington was able to commit his crimes precisely because frontier communities granted him unquestioned authority over their children based on his claimed religious credentials and educational expertise. The systematic abuse was possible only because no external oversight existed to verify his claims or monitor his treatment of students. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Kensington family's crimes, or might there have been other victims whose stories were never told? The official suppression of records means we may never know the full extent of their evil, but the evidence that has survived suggests a level of systematic cruelty that challenges our understanding of human nature. Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in American frontier history. Do you think the territorial authorities were right to suppress the details of this case? Or should the full truth have been revealed regardless of the consequences? How might frontier education have developed differently if these crimes had been widely publicized as a warning to other communities? If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The next video will explore another forgotten crime that authorities tried to bury. The case of the traveling preacher who left a trail of disappeared families across 3 states and the federal marshal who spent 10 years tracking him through the wilderness. The Prairie View Academy may be gone, its buildings burned and its cemetery relocated, but the questions it raises about trust, authority, and the protection of innocence remain as relevant today as they were in 1813. In our modern world of background checks and institutional oversight, we might think such crimes impossible. But the fundamental human capacity for evil disguised as righteousness remains unchanged. See you in the next video if you dare to keep digging into America's darkest secrets. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous monsters are those who appear most holy, most educated, and most deserving of our trust.